Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to show you how to do cloud trails, which is a technique where you take and this is all digital, it's a technique where you take a whole bunch of photos and merge them to create cloud trails to simulate a long exposure. The first thing that you need for this, of course, are clouds. Alrighty, let's get going on how to actually create images that have cloud trails. Now, this is a technique that simulates long exposure images, and there are some things you'll need right off the bat. Firstly, a good tripod. Not just any tripod, you need a good one, because if there's any shifting at all in these images, you're really going to have a hard time editing them, or may not even be able to recover them. Next up, you want a camera with, preferably, a built-in intervalometer, and ideally you want a camera that does not have a gap between the photos. Cough, cough. Sony, you could really stand to catch up in this area. The Pentax K1 is a very good example of a full-frame digital camera that has gapless interval shooting. You will also need a photo editing software capable of merging images. I will be using Photoshop CS6 Extended. I know it's very long in the tooth at this point, but any photo editing software that can do a mean blend of layers, or I would imagine any Photoshop Extended version later than CS6 would have this ability. I know this existed in Photoshop CS Extended going back at least to CS2. Next up, you're going to need some best practices, so here are some tips to get you started. The first thing is that cloud trails are a part of your images. They are not all of it, so you want to treat them like an individual element, not like the be-all and end-all of your photo. The next thing is you want to shoot in either full manual or in one of the semi-program modes like aperture priority with auto exposure lock engaged, to prevent exposure and color shifts during the capture. Shoot also in manual focus. Switch your lens to manual focus after obtaining focus, or use a manual focus lens because a focus shift during your capture will ruin it. Shoot with fixed white balance. You don't want to have your colors shifting throughout the image. This is somewhat of an optional one, by the way, guys, because if your colors do shift slightly, you're going to be taking 100 or 400 photos, averaging out every single pixel over all of those, and that color shift will be fairly well controlled if you don't have a fixed white balance. So if you forget to do this, it's not a big deal. Compose your image well, because you don't want to take a few hundred photos that don't turn out and waste all of that time capturing and editing photos that you don't like in the end. You also want to communicate with your future self about where the photos begin and end. So the way I do this is I will take a picture of my hand before I start taking the series of photos, and then I'll do all of the setup. And then after the series of photos is captured, I'll go back to my normal single frame shooting. I'll take another photo of my hand. Now, when I look through my photo roll on my computer, if I see a hand and then a bunch of identical photos after it, I know that those are a sequence I'm going to turn into a cloud trail or a waterfall blur or something like that. And then I'll create a folder. Take those photos, put them in the folder, and have them isolated away from the rest of the photos on the photo roll for the day. And then delete the two hand photos. Then the next thing I'll do is when I'm taking the photo, I will have the minimum time I possibly can between the photos. And that's going to be based primarily on cloud speed for cloud trails images. Because if you have too long of a gap, you will get saw blade clouds. And if you have too short of a gap, you're going to have way too many photos to deal with effectively. Bear in mind, we're not talking about editing one photo here. You're going to be editing potentially hundreds of photos. So if you have a raw file that's 30 megapixels and you have 400 of those, that's a whole lot of computing power that you're going to have to use, okay? You also want to keep your source images because that way you can make some neat motion effects from them. If you also work in video, you could sort of blend all of photos together. I have an old video I did. I'll put a link or a card or something like that that you can check out that shows what that's like. It is a lot of work, so I did not make it for this video because this is mostly focusing on stills. Next up, edit all of your raw photos in a batch, or if you have more raw photos than your computer can handle at once, in batches. And then what you want to do is just make sure that all of the settings are uniform, all of your edits. So the way that I will do this is I'll go into the first raw photo and I'll adjust the sliders and the sharpness or whatever as I see fit to make the image look really good. And then I'll apply it to all of the other photos that I have open. Now, if that's all of the photos for that Cloud Trails image, cool, I'm done. If it's not, if I had 400 or 500 photos in that image and I can only do 200 or something like that, I think I can do 300 of them at a time without overtaxing my computer. Then what I can do is take one of those photos and open it with the next batch as well, and then just apply all of those settings. So that way all of the settings in my raw adjustment are even across the entire shoot for this one photo that I'm going to make. And that ensures that everything's going to be the same in terms of exposure, contrast, color balance, sharpness, shadows, highlights, all of that stuff. And that's just going to give you a better finished result if you do it now. Next up, if you're using Photoshop CS6 Extended or another software with a statistics-like functionality, you are going to merge all of your photos using mean averaging. Okay, basically what you want to do is have a function that will take every single pixel in your image, take that same pixel across every single photo, and then calculate the values for each of the RGB channels in that single pixel and give an average. That is what's going to create the cloud trails or the waterfall blur. This is going to sound like weird advice, but do not clone out dust particles in RAW. And the reason for that is because when you clone out a dust particle in RAW, it'll be like a dust particle up here. And then the RAW file, it'll pull from up here, okay? Well, this is going to be in your sky. So if you pull from up here, and it's just sky right now, but in 80 photos, the cloud has moved into here. Well, now your dust particle is being cloned by something that is not the same as what's in there. And it's going to make it look like you have a glitch in that little part of your cloud trail up there. So do all of your dust particle cloning once you have finished your mean averaging, flattened your layers, and you can then, you're working in raster. That's just going to save you a whole lot of time when you start to deal with dust particles. Generally speaking, this is a technique that benefits from a small aperture. F16 is often one that I use on my lenses because that gives me the longest exposure I can. So it's if you don't, and also the deepest depth of field, so that I can create a landscape photo that has this cloud trails aspect in it. Next up, let's go through some of my cloud trails photos, and I'm going to critique them and tell you a little bit about them, and I'll let you know what I'm glad I did in them and what I would have done differently if I could go back and redo them right now. So let's start off with some of my mistakes right here first, and we're going to take a look at, let's call this 5 photos, okay? This first one shows a train, okay? And it's a good concept. The train is frozen and the clouds are moving, and what I wanted to do when I was standing on the bridge over the tracks here was take a photo to do exactly this. However, you can see along where the trees meet the sky that the trees are moving, and then they're stationary in the rest of the scene. The way that I did this was I took one single frame of the tram right there and superimposed it over the cloud trails. It was impossible to fully blend that effectively without having those trees moving along the perimeter. It's not the end of the world, but I always look at that and just think that it's not the best I could have done. I could not have done better given the setting that I had, but I would have liked it to have been different. Here's a shot that looks like it's going to be really, like there's nothing wrong with it, right? Well, so look up at the clouds in the sky. Cloud trails. The trees look great, by the way. There was no wind down at ground level here. There was no wind in the mountains. Down at ground level there was, because when I blended all of this, the grass was very blurry. So I took a single frame and dropped it in for the lake. And if you look at the log in the foreground, halfway up, you can see the cloud there is not blurry. Yeah, because this was a single frame. And that is a mistake that I made that indicates the type of mistake I made. If I had it to do over again, I would probably go into this final image, grab that one bit of cloud that's very apparent there, and then just do a motion blur and call it close enough. Here's a shot that I took many years ago. This was one of my first cloud trail experiments, and you can see sawtooth clouds in the sky. I think I had a 5-second, give or take, exposure time between each image. And you can also see a dust spot there that I completely missed, and just now for the first time I'm seeing. At any rate, there's a bunch of sawtooth clouds here because the gap between the photos was too long. And quite frankly, that's not a look that is good. It's not one you want to go for because it's not natural and it's not smooth. And if you're going to do this, it is worth trying to get nice, smooth clouds because that's going to be more dramatic and more pleasing for the majority of your viewers. Here's a shot of, that looks like Blanca. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's Blanca Peak down in southern Colorado. It is, okay. And so if you look along the top of the mountains there, it's going to be hard to see. You'll have to do a little bit of trust me on this, but it's sort of blurry. And that's because the tripod was in some soft soil and it settled as the photo was being taken, and the tops of the mountains are blurry. So the way that you can fix this after you do your cloud trails, for clouds, that little bit of syncing does not matter. What I tried to do here was then clone out one of the mountain one of the photos, clone or remove everything but the mountain in the foreground, and then just superimpose it over. And I just did a bad job of that. So that's why the mountains look like they're blurry. It's not because the clouds were moving through them. It's because I just did a bad job of managing the foreground, and that's something to bear in mind. It's not just enough to have a good tripod. You've got to have a good footing for your tripod. Otherwise, your foreground is going to shift and you're going to end up with subpar results because of that. In this last one here, the sky is okay. The clouds were moving so fast with this when I was taking this photo, and the 1 second delay from the Sony a7 IV was not enough, or was too much rather. It was not fast enough. You can see up in the close clouds how there's these lines, and that's because even though this was only like a 15 or 20 second photo, I mean, there were not many images in this. The clouds were just blazing through the scene. So there's that problem. And then there's the other problem of the foreground. The water just looks not good. It's not smooth. If I had this to do over again, I think instead of using an intervalometer, I would have just set the camera to the slowest burst mode setting, low, which is about 3 frames a second, and then just held down the photo until buffer underrun and called it a day, and done what I could with it. Then with the water, I could also have gone in and blended this or smoothed it in post with some raster edits. I just chose not to because the rest of the photo, it's fine. Like, it's not offensive, but the clouds, I mean, they kind of ruin it for me. So let's go to some ones that I think I did fairly well, and we'll go through a handful of these, and I'll tell you what I did with them so that you can replicate it. We'll start off here with this photo of the lighthouse, and this was my first cloud trail photo that I thought this really turned out well. And I used this is either the K3 or the K7, I forget which. I think the K7. And it did have a built-in intervalometer in it, I believe, and so I just took as many photos as I could. Manual focus lens, Pentax SMC 50mm f1.4, and then blended everything in post. This turned out well. I had a good footing for the tripod. The tripod was really solid. Manual focus lens, good intervalometer. Clouds weren't moving too quickly, and the sunset lighting was absolutely fantastic. Here's one that was taken with the K3, and this is a tree overlooking Walnut Creek in California. So this is up in Lime Ridge, open space for those of you who know the area, at sunset. So what I did here was I took a cloud trails photo at sunset. You can see that in the sky. Then I waited until the sun went down, which was about another half hour later. And I took another photo with all of the lights on in the city, and then I put that photo over the finished cloud trails photo so that I would have the sunset as well as the lights on at the same time. And ultimately, this was a pretty successful image. I've always really liked this one. We'll take a look at this shot of Crystal Mill here in Colorado. And this was taken a couple of autumns ago. It's a 14-mile round-trip hike to get there. It's a brutal one, but totally worth it. And you can see the cloud trails here. And on this one, I did a fairly decent job of blending the trees into the image. You can see there's one spot in the left corner where the trees have a little bit of motion, but by and large, I did a pretty good job of getting rid of all the tree motion when I put a single image over the averaged image with just the trees so that they weren't all blurry and moving. This is just something I like. I like to have the moving clouds and frozen trees or a frozen foreground. The lake itself, or the area at the bottom of the falls, was extensively edited, just full disclosure. I did put in like 8 or 12 different layers and then broke the layers into different parts and then used very subtle motion blur to replicate the actual movement of the water in that little pool and to accommodate the movement of the water for the perspective of the 15 millimeter Irix Blackstone lens that I used to take this photo. That took many, many, many hours to get it looking good. Here's one that combined a stationary foreground and an astrophotograph and cloud trails. Okay, so this was one of my early experiments in taking different layers. You can see in the water wheel that there is blur, except for the frozen water wheel, right? And that's because I was taking the many photos for the cloud trails. At the end, I took a single photo with a flash to get the frozen water wheel, and I guess I could have theoretically gone in there, desaturated or darkened or color shifted that brown channel, but I think that would have messed up the whole water wheel without me, doing some more fancy stuff that I wasn't thinking of at that time. This is another very old photo taken with the K3. Then I did the cloud trails image. Very still trees, didn't have to do anything with those. And then I took one image through the clouds of the stars and put those in as they were. And so there's a few different layers going on here, but overall, it was all just taken with one camera in one location. Here's one that I took in Bilbao. This is one of my favorite photos, and I really love the way that this image turned out with the lighting and the water and the clouds. Everything just kind of came together really well here. I did have to edit the foreground a lot to remove a bunch of trash cans, which I am not a fan of in the foregrounds, but by and large, this image is just what came out. I did take the star trails, and I did take a single frame of the photos, and put that down there instead of using the blended foreground, because the lighting in one of the specific frames was just way more dramatic than it was averaged over all of the photos in the sequence. So that's one thing you probably picked up on, is I'll often say, I took the clouds and then I took one of the frames and I put this one still frame over. And if you do that, you will likely find yourself getting better results because you'll have a single crisp frame for all the foreground details, and you'll be retaining a lot of that nice frozen motion in the foreground with the blurry sky. Here's an example of a waterfall and cloud trail photo, and this is the exact same technique. Lots of different photos, fixed parameters, and blending them all together. And this is an example of how you can use this to get both cloud motion and waterfall motion at the same time. Here's another photo that's very similar. It's on Lake Haiaha while it was frozen. I think this was Haiaha. And while I was taking this, I was using the Irix 11mm, and there was this guy lacing up his ice skates next to me. I said, hey, can you do me a favor when you finish your lacing up? Can you just skate in that area right in front of me? And I explained to him what I was going to try to do with this photo, and he's like, yeah, that'd be awesome. And so he did. He just went out and skated right in front of it. And so I took one of those frames. The whole foreground is from that one of those frames, including the ice skaters in the background and the mountains. Gives you a nice, very crisp foreground image. And then the clouds were from the rest of that sequence. If there were one thing I was not super thrilled with in this image, if you look on the mountains on the left side where the cloud is coming out of the mountain, that bright streak of cloud, you can see some rainbow. And that was a little bit of lens ghosting that occurred along that rainbow. And it's an okay look. It actually doesn't bother me, but it every now and then stands out as like, why is there this bright spot on the mountain? Oh yeah, it's a lens artifact. Here's a shot from Capitol Peak, which is another incredible hike here in Colorado, another 14 or 15 mile round trip hike. So we hiked out here. I got down to the lake at the bottom of Capitol Peak and photographed it with the clouds. And basically what you can see here is just the photo was long enough. The clouds were moving kind of slowly that day. The photo was long enough that the water took on this nice, smooth, somewhat blurry look to it. This is a look I actually really like with the water because it does blur out the clouds really nicely, and you can still kind of see what's under it when it turns out well. And I still had a nice set of clouds here and was able to get some good crispness in the mountains. One thing I did here to work with the mountain a little bit was I took the mountain layer, which was everything basically in the middle, from the water up to the ridgeline of the mountains, down into the saddle and back up over to the right. And then I made that its own layer, desaturated the blue channel pretty significantly, and that's why the mountain looks very, very gray here, because before that it had just looked very blue. It almost sort of blended into the water and sky. So that's a technique you can do with your landscape photos writ large, is to take the foregrounds, desaturate the blue channel, and you'll end up with things that look maybe a little bit more to your liking. Don't do that with water and sky because that can look kind of fake. Here's a photo from Tampere in Finland, and or Tampere, I forget how it's pronounced. Anyway, pretty similar technique to what I've been going on about here. Took a whole bunch of photos. On the right side, you can see the dude drinking coffee and the people frozen in place. And basically what I did with that was take the foreground of just the bridge and the building, I think also, and the buildings in the back, and dropped those in where the image where the averaged image was, because that gave me those people frozen. And so it gives this look of people being frozen in time as the clouds are moving very quickly or over them. And also it's a little bit less distracting to have your foreground elements being stationary and crisp than, say, a walkway full of ghostly shaped people who are all slightly blurry. We'll do one last one here because this was the last photo I ever took with my Pentax K1 before it died. And this is a way to capture like a scene with a person in it. Here, that's me down there. I was out hiking that day and with my wife and one of our buddies, and we went up to the Chihuahua Lake. I think that's not Chihuahua. Well, anyway, we went up to this lake. And I said, I'm going to go down there and take photos. So I did. And you can see a lot of what we've talked about going on in here. Clouds up in the sky, nice, smooth, but not clear water. I mean, you can see into it, but it looks like it looks like a piece of glass that's been sanded, which is a look I really like. And then if I had one thing to do over again, I probably would have cropped myself out of one of the photos and had it so that my head wasn't like moving in this image, but it's okay. And then other than that, the only other thing I really have for you guys when it comes to this technique is make sure you compose it well. However you want it to look is up to you. This is your ability to take an element of the sky and turn it into a creative aspect of your photos. So just create your photos how you want to, and then use the sky trails to amplify the meaning that you want in your photos or the story you want them to tell. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in whatever video comes next.